a gem. It is something like I've never seen in Arizona. I couldn't believe it when I first laid eyes on it.
A bunch of fish died recently at Portner Reservoir that's in Fossil Creek Park.
With nothing but concrete and steel, Arizona quietly drained a desert creek for nearly 100 years, powering a fast-growing city while the river itself slowly died. The dam stood for progress and electricity, but behind it, native fish found nowhere else on Earth were pushed to the edge of disappearing forever. In 2005, it all came to an unexpected end when the very company that built it agreed to shut it down. So what actually happened once the water was finally let go, and was the recovery really as fast as the reports suggest? Join us as we uncover Arizona's desert river comeback and why scientists still can't quite explain how fast it happened.
Over how to divide up water from the Colorado River. I wanted to dive deeper and take a closer look at the Hoover Dam and just how crucial it is to our state, our region, and the entire nation.
The river that was silenced. To understand why Fossil Creek amazed scientists so much, you have to go back to before the dam. Back to a time when this creek was already something the desert had spent thousands of years perfecting. This Fossil Creek sits deep inside a canyon in central Arizona. The canyon is so steep you could stack the Statue of Liberty inside it 4 times over. And despite the name, there are no fossils here at all. What early travelers actually found were twigs and leaves covered in pale stone-like shells. But what they did not know was that what they found was actually travertine, a type of limestone the water builds on its own, wherever the current slows down. And that one detail changes everything that comes next. Stick with us because this creek is about to get a lot stranger. The reason this happens comes down to a cluster of springs at the base of the canyon. These springs push out about 20,000 gallons of water every single minute. You see, this does not happen every hour of every day. It happens all year round, whether in drought or in flood. Because of it, the water stays a steady 70 to 72 degrees, even in a state where most rivers dry up completely by midsummer. That kind of steady water flow should not exist in the desert, but it does. And over thousands of years, it quietly built one of the richest, strangest ecosystems in the American Southwest. Glowing turquoise pools, natural stone terraces rising layer by layer across the creek bed, more than 30 species of trees and shrubs lining the banks. Over 100 species of birds pass through every year. Fish that existed nowhere else on the planet, shaped by thousands of years of living in this one exact stretch of water. All of it running exactly the way it had for centuries, completely undisturbed by people. Then in 1900, someone filed a piece of paper, and everything changed. Long before that, Yavapai and Apache peoples had lived in this canyon for around 10,000 years. To them, it wasn't just land. It was ancestral ground, passed down through generation after generation. But nearby mining towns needed electricity, and a spring that never stopped flowing looked to some people like power going to waste. So a rancher named Lou Turner claimed the creek for himself. A year later, he claimed the springs too. Nobody asked the people who had lived there for 10 millennia what they thought. What happened next is one of the strangest construction stories in Arizona history. Almost nobody outside the state has ever heard it. The nearest railroad stop was more than 40 miles away across rugged mountains with no road at all. So the builders made one from scratch, cutting a path straight through raw wilderness. More than 400 miles and 600 workers moved heavy machinery down that trail. Most of these workers were Apache and Mojave men. They dropped 1,600 feet down into the canyon, carrying turbines, cement, and steel on their backs and on the backs of the mules. Some of them never made it back out. Their names were barely recorded. Their work built something that would run for almost 100 years. By 1909, the first power plant was running in the Fossil Creek, Arizona. But it did not end there. A second one followed a few years later. To keep both plants fed with water, engineers built over 8,800 feet of wooden flumes, snaking along the canyon wall. They also built a dam near the springs that swallowed almost the entire stream, leaving almost nothing behind for the creek itself. And here's the part almost nobody expects: it worked far too well. By 1920, this small remote hydroelectric project was supplying nearly 70% of the electricity for the fast-growing city of Phoenix. Streetlights were supported by it, various Streetcars ran on it, and even some of the valley's very first air conditioners used it too. All of that power came from water rising out of limestone rock 100 miles away from the city. A quiet desert creek was secretly running one of the fastest growing cities in the American West, and almost nobody living under those streetlights ever knew where the power came from. But while the power plants were being celebrated and later named a historic engineering landmark, something far more troubling was happening just downstream. Stay with us, because this is where the real damage started and where the story gets much darker before it gets better. With nearly all its water pulled into the flumes, the creek below the dam slowed to almost nothing. The travertine stopped forming completely. The turquoise pools shrank down to a fraction of their old size. Fish that had evolved specifically for this one creek and lived nowhere else on Earth were pushed into tiny remaining pockets of water. At the same time, other fish that didn't belong there moved in and quietly took over what little space was left, hunting the natives that had nowhere left to hide. For a creek whose entire identity was built on turning water into stone, this wasn't just a climb. It was a slow, silent erasure, and almost nobody outside the area even noticed. This went on for nearly 100 years, while the dam kept winning historical honors and awards, completely unaware of what it had quietly buried downstream. By the 1990s, the two power plants were old, outdated, and by modern standards, barely worth running at all. Environmental groups had spent years warning that the diversion was wrecking the creek's rock formations, draining its wetlands, and pushing native species toward extinction, species found nowhere else on the planet. The company that owned the plants had a choice to make. They could spend a fortune repairing century-old machinery just to keep generating a small trickle of electricity nobody really needed anymore. Or they could give the river back to nature and undo almost 100 years of damage in one decision. What they decided to do next would turn this quiet, forgotten desert creek into one of the most closely watched restoration projects in the entire country. But before anyone could turn the water back on, there was a battle nobody expected: the fight to get the dam flowing. One thing many did not expect the company to do was to simply give up 20,000 gallons of water a minute. But that's exactly what happened next. You see, by the 1990s, the Childs and Irving power plants were producing barely 0.1% of the electricity Arizona Public Service generated across its entire system. That's how small this operation had become. Meanwhile, the plants were still diverting up to 95% of Fossil Creek's flow, year after year, just to squeeze out that tiny sliver of power. Environmental groups noticed the imbalance immediately. So, starting in the late 1990s, organizations like American Rivers, the Center for Biological Diversity, the Sierra Club, and the Arizona Riparian Council began pushing back hard. They began sending letters, phone calls, emails, and even newspaper stories. It got so bad that one of the groups even threatened legal action if the utility tried to renew its license without changing anything. Here's the twist: Arizona Public Service didn't fight them in court. Instead, in 1999, the company sat down with the very groups pressuring it, along with the Yavapai Apache Nation, the Nature Conservancy, and Northern Arizona Audubon Society, and agreed to shut the whole operation down. At an estimated cost of about $13 million, APS chose to decommission both plants completely and hand the creek its water back. That decision made history. It was only the second time in the entire United States that a dam had been dismantled purely for environmental reasons, not for safety, not for money, just to undo the damage. The first had happened just a few years earlier in Maine, but that project was meant to save fish that people actually fished for. Fossil Creek was different. The species it was meant to save had almost no commercial value at all. This was restoration for its own sake. For the Yavapai Apache Nation, the moment carried a different kind of weight entirely. Their ancestors had helped build this dam more than 90 years earlier, carrying equipment down a canyon that had cost lives to descend. Now their descendants were watching that same structure get switched off for good. Nation Chairman Vincent Randall spoke publicly about what the moment meant, calling the return of the water to Fossil Creek a return of something sacred to a more natural state. It wasn't just a power plant closing. It was a piece of ancestral land finally being allowed to heal. But here's the thing almost nobody realized at the time. You cannot just flip the water back on and expect everything to be fine. In fact, doing that carelessly could have made things worse, not better. By 2004, the stretch of creek below the dam was full of fish that didn't belong there. These invaders had taken over during the decades. The native fish were pushed into tiny remaining pools. If the full flow came rushing back before anyone dealt with that problem, the invasive fish would have exploded in number 2 and finished off the very species the whole restoration was trying to save. So a massive cleanup operation began. In the fall of 2004, close to 100 people, including the United States Forest Service, Arizona Game and Fish, and scientists from Northern Arizona University, went into the creek and physically removed the non-native fish. Then they built a barrier downstream specifically designed to stop those invaders from ever swimming back upstream again. The sequence mattered, and the pattern was simply to clear out what didn't belong, hold the line. Then finally give the native fish back the one thing they'd been denied for nearly a century, their own river. While all of this was happening, a biologist named Dr. Jane Marks from Northern Arizona University was doing something almost no scientist ever gets the chance to do. She had already spent years studying the starved creek before the water was ever turned back on, tracking its chemistry, its fish, and its rock formations against a healthy stretch of stream further upstream that still ran at full flow. That gave her team a real, measurable baseline. When the water finally returned, they wouldn't just be guessing at how much had changed. They would have actual numbers to compare it against. Marks would later call this one of the only dam decommissionings in the world where a team this broad, made up of biologists, hydrologists, geologists, and engineers, joined forces to study both the costs and the benefits of giving a river back its water. The project became such a landmark case that it was even turned into an award-winning public broadcasting service documentary narrated by actor Ted Danson. Then came the day everything had been building toward. On June 18, 2005, Arizona Public Service shut off the flume for good. For the first time since 1909, the full weight of Fossil Springs ran down its own canyon exactly the way it had for thousands of years before anyone ever touched it. The water didn't rush in dramatically. It crept forward, slowly filling pools, side channels, and empty stretches of rock that hadn't felt real current in nearly a century. Scientists and locals stood along the banks and watched it happen in real time. This was the first time any desert stream in the entire American Southwest had ever had its full natural flow restored. Nobody had a playbook for what would happen next. Nobody knew if the ecosystem could actually come back or how long it might take if it did. They were about to find out faster than anyone imagined possible. So keep watching, because this story is far from over. The moment the desert came back to life. Scientists had braced for a recovery that could take decades. The creek had other plans. Almost as soon as the water returned, the most basic processes of a living stream began working again. Photosynthesis in the creek climbed. The stream's ability to process nutrients matched the levels found in a healthy stretch upstream, one that had never been touched by the dam at all. And this didn't take years to happen. It happened within a few seasons. The lesson hidden inside that data was simple and honestly, kind of beautiful. A river isn't a machine that stays broken forever once you break it. Give it back its water and much of the damage can undo itself, faster than anyone thought possible. The rock told the same story. Along the stretches that had been starved for water for nearly a century, travertine formation had gone almost completely quiet. The moment full flow returned, that process kicked back into motion almost immediately. New stone terraces began rising along the creek. The turquoise pools that had once defined this canyon started refilling and deepening again exactly the way they had for thousands of years before anyone touched them. But the real headline was the fish. Before restoration, native species in Fossil Creek had been pushed to the edge of collapse, squeezed into tiny remaining pockets of water, while non-native fish took over everything else. Once the invaders were removed and full flow was restored, researchers recorded something remarkable. Combined flow restoration and the removal of non-native fish produced roughly a 50-fold increase in native fish density, with researchers counting close to 49,000 individual native fish recovered across 5 key species. Flow restoration on its own helped too, producing close to a 3-fold increase, but it was clearing out the invaders that made the real difference. Without that step, the native fish never would have had the room to come back at all. Today, Fossil Creek holds 9 native fish species, several of them endangered, threatened, or considered sensitive by wildlife officials. And it holds a distinction no other river in Arizona can claim. It is now the longest stretch of river in the entire state where the native fish community remains completely free of non-native species. Wildlife officials even opened the country's first catch-and-release-only roundtail chub fishing season here, giving anglers a rare chance to fish for a native species in its own native water. Plant Life told a similar story. In the 50-acre botanical area surrounding the springs alone, researchers have recorded 166 different plant species. Combined with the fish, the birds, and the wildlife drawn back to the canyon, Fossil Creek quietly became one of the richest, most biologically diverse places in the entire American Southwest. And this is where it gets really interesting. In 2009, Congress recognized just how special this place had become, designating nearly 17 miles of Fossil Creek as a wild and scenic river, one of only 2 rivers in all of Arizona to carry that protection. And people noticed. Word about the clear, warm turquoise water sitting in the middle of the high desert spread fast. By the mid-2010s, close to 100,000 people were visiting Fossil Creek every single year. For many of them, it became a yearly tradition. Yajira Hernandez, a Phoenix resident, spent the day there with her family, food, and music, describing it simply as their spot to be together, swimming in one pool before moving on to the waterfall later in the day. For families like hers, a place that had been sealed off from the public for nearly a century had become something close to sacred in its own right, just in a different way than it was to the tribes who came before them. But that popularity came with a cost. Rangers reported seeing more than 300 cars parked along roads never meant to hold that kind of traffic. With that large crowd, trash piled up. Riverbanks that had just spent years recovering were suddenly being trampled all over again. Think about that for a second. A creek that had survived nearly a century of industrial diversion was now being worn down by people showing up with coolers and water shoes. The Forest Service had to step in, and this time, the fix wasn't decommissioning a dam. It was limiting people. Officials rolled out a permit and reservation system capping how many visitors could enter the canyon each day during the busiest stretch of the year, from around April through September. Forest Ranger Dex Allen, who had worked the Fossil Creek area for more than a decade, summed up the irony perfectly at the time, saying the place people loved wasn't at risk of being drained anymore. It was at risk of being loved to death. The springs themselves, though, don't seem to care about any of it. They're still running exactly the way they have for thousands of years, pushing out roughly 20,000 gallons of water every single minute, quietly turning water back into stone. And this point to one decision, made back in 1999, to stop taking and simply let a river be a river again, that decision rebuilt one of the most remarkable ecosystems in America. And it did it faster than anyone, even the scientists who studied it closest, ever thought possible. What do you think about how fast this desert creek came back to life? Share your thoughts in the comments section below. If you found this video valuable, like, share, and subscribe to our channel for more deep dive investigations into the quiet comebacks happening across America. Click the next video on your screen right now. You will not regret it.